Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. We are so glad to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about parameters. Now, this is an advanced session, which means that you all are advanced users, or at least you're well on the way to becoming advanced users. You know the knobs and levers that Tableau gives you to explore your data. And maybe you're thinking, I want to build my own knobs and my own levers to explore my data in the way I want. And that's what parameters are really about. It's about giving you control over your data. And then at the end of the day, when you publish your dashboard, it's about giving your users, your viewers, the ability to control the data and explore it in the ways that you give them. So we're going on this tour through the land of parameters. We'll be your guides. A little bit about us. My name's Matt. I like to hike. I'm a dev manager at Tableau, but when I am not at work, I like to get as far away from technology as I can get. Usually, that's in the mountains around Washington, but when I have the chance, I love to go hiking internationally as well. Just this last year, my wife and I went out to South America, and it was just an amazing trip. I also keep chickens. Now, at Tableau Conference, a lot of people ask me, what is my favorite feature in Tableau? And that's a hard question. That's not a fair question. It's like asking me, which of my chickens is my favorite chicken? And that's not fair to the rest of the flock. Every feature at Tableau is amazing, and I love every single one of them equally. Now, I'm going to hand you over to my partner, Nick.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Ritzko, and I love travel and adventure, too. Now, my style is a little different than Matt's. Where Matt's trying to get away from technology, I always have a camera in my hand, like here, getting off a seaplane in Alaska. Now, in the last couple of years, my life has changed, and my travel choices are influenced by this little one. So 2 years ago, my wife and I took the adventure of a lifetime. We went to Florida during hurricane season. I mean, who goes to the Gulf during hurricane season? And we brought back this beautiful baby girl. So now I look for family-friendly adventures, hopefully with a photo op along the way. But speaking of adventure, I've been with Tableau now for about 6 years. That's back to version 8.0 for anyone keeping count. And in that release, a few of us rallied together as newbies, new employees, a couple interns, and we built a subscriptions feature. And it's a feature that I still use today to run my business, which is leading engineering for our core analytics scenarios in visualization and calculations. And I can agree, parameters are pretty neat, too. Now, every great journey starts at Basecamp, so let's spend a minute just to make sure we're all talking the same language when we're talking about parameters. Parameters are a pretty simple concept on their own. They're a form of user input, a way of letting users specify a value. If you're a programmer in the audience, you might think of a parameter like a variable. It holds a value, and you can reference it elsewhere. And that's really useful for building analysis like what-if analysis. So if you want to build a dashboard that shows how your business might have done differently, had some macroeconomic thing like inflation changed, you can provide a slider on that dashboard, and you can let your end user tweak that value and see how the simulation updates. Now, parameters are really just a data source. More specifically, the parameters are the fields in the data source, but they live in a special hidden data source called parameters. And the reason I bring that up is you can think of these fields, they can be referenced in any calculation, in a set definition, or anywhere else where you would reference data. Think of it as a solid column of the same value. And with that, we're going to jump straight into demo. So here I am in Tableau, and we have a data set here that is hikes across Washington state. This data comes from the Washington Trails Association, and you can imagine that each row in this data set represents a hike. So maybe in your mind, think about a guidebook to hikes, where each page talks about a hike, its length, its elevation, some of the things you might see along the way. And here we're looking at the collection of hikes and their lengths. Now, I've created a parameter up here called my top end parameter. I can edit it so you can just see it's got a default value of 5, has a minimum of 1, maximum of 25. And these are all just values I set about that parameter when I create it. And as I move the slider, you'll notice that absolutely nothing happens. This is one of the first things to take away about parameters, which is that on their own, they don't do anything. It's not until you wire them up to another calculation or part of the Tableau experience that they actually have meaning and value. So to do that, we'll take our hike title, we'll duplicate the field over on our filter, and I'll go to the top tab here. And Tableau gives me a way to say I want the top n by, and then length of the hike in this case. So I can say top 10 and hit apply, and the view updates in the background. But Tableau also gives me easy access to that parameter name. So I can choose that parameter, and when I hit OK, now my parameter actually changes the number of rows. Now, the second important thing to think about here is when I publish this up to Tableau Server, anyone who comes to this visualization will have that level of control over what they see in the view. But this is a pretty easy example. This is just getting us warmed up. Matt, I think we can do something even better.
Yeah, I think we can do something really cool with parameters. What I want to see is something like this, like a dashboard that gives me all kinds of control. I want to be able to find the perfect hike by dialing in the elevation gain and the distance, and maybe selecting what kinds of things that I want to see along the way. So let's try and build something more like this, but first we're going to take a big step back. So this looks very similar. This is, again, just that list of hikes and the length of the hike. Now, when I'm trying to find the perfect hike for me, I want to find something that's short enough to do in a day. And what that means is different day to day. On a long summer day, I might go for the entire day, and on a cold autumn weekend, I might only want to be out for a few hours. So I want to be able to dial in exactly what length of a hike I'm looking for. To do that, I'm going to use a parameter. So I'm going to create a parameter. I'm going to call this parameter max length. Now, I want this to be a floating point number. That's a number with a decimal as opposed to an integer, which is just whole numbers. And I'm going to give it a sensible default. I'm going to set a range up so that it can be anything from 1 to 15 miles, and we're going to use half-mile increments. And now I'm going to add it to my sheet. And just like with Nick's example, it doesn't do anything because parameters don't have value in their own. It's how you use them. So let's put this parameter to work. So I'm going to go into my filter here, and we'll see the condition of it is comparing against a static value right now. And I'm going to update that condition to use the parameter that I just created. And now, when I click OK, the viz updates based on what I've set here. Now, that's cool. I could do that with a measure filter. And that's fair. There's a lot of ways to do things in Tableau. The real place where parameters shine is when you start driving multiple behaviors off of the same parameter. So the first thing that I'm going to do is add that parameter to the title of my sheet. I'm going to call this sheet hikes under, and I'm going to use the parameter value here. I'm going to insert the parameter value, and then I'm going to say miles. So now, the title of my sheet is hikes under 9 miles, and as I update the value of my parameter, that title updates too. Cool. So filters are one way to draw attention to data. But another way that we could use is color. And so I'm going to use a set to color my marks based on the value of a parameter. So here, again, it's that same list of data, but now I've created a set, and I've dragged it onto color. And just like I did with the filter, I'm going to make this dynamic by attaching it to a parameter. So I'm going to edit the set, and just like before, in the condition, instead of comparing to a static value, I compare it to the parameter, I click OK, and now the coloring updates based on the value of that set. So now I get to keep the context while still drawing attention to the thing that I care about. So what are some other ways that we can draw attention to the data we care about? Well, another one is a reference line. So let's try that out. I'm going to go, once again, it's that same sheet. And this time, I'm going to take a reference line and drag it out. And in the value of my reference line, I'm going to reference the parameter that's on the sheet. And now, just like that, I have a line on my viz that will move around according to the value of my parameter. That way, my user can visually inspect the data and see what does and doesn't meet their criteria. So I'm just going to move it around, and like that, the line follows my parameter value. And going back to that really big point of driving many behaviors off of the same parameter, I'm going to combine the reference line and the set. So now, as I change the parameter value, the line moves around, and everything below the line is highlighted. Cool. So now we're going to take it another step further. So we've already seen filters, and one thing I notice on this viz is that there's a ton of data that I just am not going to care about because it's way outside of my condition. I want to keep a little bit of context so that I can see maybe what I was just going to miss out on, but I don't want to show a ton of stuff that I just am not interested in. So I'm going to add a filter. I already have my line and my set, but I'm going to update my filter, but this time I'm not going to use the parameter value directly. I'm going to add a little bit of padding onto it. So this time, instead of comparing directly to the parameter value, I'll add a half mile on so I can see any hike that almost is what I was specifying so that I can see what kinds of things I'm missing out on. And I set that, and now the data that I'm really interested in, the stuff that's at the top of my condition, is always in screen as I scroll through my parameter values. But it's not quite what I'm looking for because, well, sometimes there are like 7 values there. Sometimes there's like 3, sometimes only 1. And what I really want is a consistent amount of context each time, no matter what my value is set to. So to get that, I'm going to use a table calculation. So in my next sheet here, you'll see that I've labeled each row with an index, and that index is relative to where the start of the set is. The first item in the set is 0. Everything after it is a positive number. Everything behind it is a negative number. And all I have to do to get exactly what I'm looking for, which is just a few items outside of the set, is I just drag that table calculation to filters. And now I can filter out anything that is less than, let's say, -3. And now I always get 3 items at the top, and no matter what I've set my parameter value to. So I don't have that issue with everything jumping around. Cool. So that's a lot of examples with a list of data. If I've learned anything at Tableau, if a list of data is cool, a scatter plot is even cooler. So we're going to project this data, and now instead of just looking at the length, I'm also going to look at the elevation gain on the hike. And I have my reference line and my highlighting just the way I did before. But now what I want to do, because length is not the only criteria I'm looking for when I'm going on a hike. I want to find something that's short enough to do in a day, but also hard enough to really hurt my legs. So I'm going to add another line, another set to have the criteria of what things are have enough elevation gain to really hurt. So adding the reference line was easy, and I have a set for elevation gain. Let's try putting that one on. So I put my elevation set on color, but that's still not quite getting me what I'm looking for. Now I have the elevation condition highlighted, but what I really want is both. And the way I'm going to get there is with a combined set. So I select both of the sets that I have, the length and the elevation, and I'm going to say, create a combined set. I'm going to call this elevation and distance. And I want to see items that meet both of my criteria, so I'm going to select the option for shared members in both sets. I click OK. I drag my new set out onto color, and then I update the colors to match the rest of my presentation. And just like that, exactly the quadrant of data that I'm looking for is highlighted. So I can combine the sets together to show items that meet both of those criteria. Super cool, but, well, Nick, what else would you do with this?
Yeah, so I want to recap 2 things here that we've learned. One is that Matt's choice of hikes is somewhat questionable, and two is that the power of parameters is when you can start to combine them together to do things. So quadrants are cool, but what if we want to break our data into a few more cohorts? Well, we can do that, just that, and keep layering on with this concept of sets and driving the set membership from parameter values. So I mentioned before that I have this daughter, and I want to take her out on a hike with me. And so we're probably not looking for greater than 1,500 feet of elevation. We're probably looking for something a little easier. And we'll do that by adding a parameter to look at the gain of the hike. Up here, I can edit that parameter. And I want to point out a couple things here as we define this parameter. First is that we're using a Boolean value. That's pretty simple. That's true or false. And it turns out computers are really pretty good at dealing with true and false. They're a little slower if you're trying to compare strings and compare values against each other. So if you find yourself in a place where you can use this sort of true-false calculation, you can actually get a little bit of a performance gain. So I wanted to call that out for everybody. The second thing I want to focus on here is at the bottom, we have the ability to create our own alias. So I don't have to live with my dropdown saying just true and false. I can come in here and add something a little more friendly, like at least and at most. And when I click OK, my parameter dropdown updates with those values. Now, as we pointed out before, whenever we use a parameter, we have to hook it up to something. So we'll continue with the set example by editing our elevation set. And you'll see here, this dialog looks a lot like a filter dialog. If I go to the condition here, I'm actually specifying a calculation that helps Tableau know which items are inside and outside of my set. So it's currently kind of hard-coded to just be above the line. But since that parameter was a Boolean value, we can very easily do a simple if, then, else, where we choose between things above the line and things below the line. Hit apply, dismiss the dialog, and now as I change this value, I can see the hikes that fall into that lower left quartile, or not quartile, but cohort. Now the other one that we've added here is across the x-axis. We've broken that what was previously a quadrant into 3 parts. So we've added short, medium, and long. Let me go in and edit that parameter and walk you through something really interesting that's happening here, which is that I'm putting in these values of short, medium, long, and telling Tableau how to think about those. Our data set doesn't have short, medium, or long anywhere in it. It's not an attribute of the hike. We're going to actually create this new domain of data inside this field, and then we're going to wire up a calculation that references that. So as I pick different parameter values, Tableau is evaluating some criteria and deciding, is this hike short, medium, or long? Now, just like before, we'll use a set to do that. And for ease of use, I don't have to uncomment this one. I'll just walk through the calculation. So we're doing something in programming called a case statement. So we're taking the value of the parameter, and for each valid value of that parameter, we're telling Tableau how to figure out which marks should be in or out of the set. So if I choose short in the dropdown, then Tableau is going to look for hikes that are less than 5 miles. If I choose medium, it's looking for things between 5 and 10. And if I choose long, it's going to grab all the values greater than 10. And just like that, I can now switch between short, medium, and long. And again, like I said, these values, short, medium, long, don't exist in the data set. We're literally creating new ways of slicing the data, kind of a new dimension right here using a parameter. One of the few ways in Tableau that you can kind of type in your own values for slicing data. Now, I mentioned my daughter and wanting to go on a shorter, lower elevation hike, but I also mentioned having a camera, and I'd love to see some wildlife along the way. So we can take this even a step further. We can add yet another dimension into our criteria. And to do that, I want to take a step back to the bar chart, and talk a little bit about proportional brushing, where we're showing percent of total in and out. So in this view, we're looking at the regions of hikes, and we're using our same set logic to decide which of these hikes, what percentage of hikes in each group, or what number of hikes actually have a given attribute. So our parameter here this time is about the attributes, and I have one for wildlife, I have summits, I have lakes along the way. And you can see that as I change these values, I'm getting that updated percent of total right there in the view. And again, all of this is powered by sets. Of course, if we can do it in one dimension, we can also do the same thing in 2 dimensions. So here's back to the scatter plot. And I can choose wildlife. And just like that, we can bring it back into our whole analysis. And so now, when I choose wildlife and invert the gain, short hike, I can find the 4 hikes that are perfect for me and my daughter. And Matt can use the same view to go find the hikes that are perfect for him and his wife. And that's one of the really important things about parameters and what they can enable. They can actually allow you to craft an experience that you can publish up to server, and your users can interact with that to find the perfect analysis for them. Matt, this is pretty cool, but I think we can do some more on a map.
Yeah, so maps are another really powerful part of Tableau, and we're actually going to take a little bit of a detour here because no journey is complete without just a little bit of a detour. So this is a tool that we see a lot of people using with parameters and maps, where you can actually choose different dimensions to plot on the map using a parameter. So this parameter here already has 3 dimensions in my data set. The data that we have breaks hikes into major regions, minor regions, and then the hikes themselves. And we're going to use this dropdown to swap out those dimensions based on a calculated field. Now, if you're just in authoring mode and you're in the flow of analysis, you can just drag out pills like all over the place. But once you publish that workbook and you want somebody to have that ability to swap things back out, you have to give that back to them. So parameters are a way to do that. So here, I'm going to edit my calculated field. And this is another case statement. So instead of just returning a static dimension, we are going to use the case statement to choose which dimension to return based on the selected value in the parameter. And when I apply this calculation, I can now see all of the minor regions in my data, and then when I drill into hike, I can see every hike in the data set plotted on the map. So let's take this back to what we were doing before. Here we have a worksheet that has the same parameter controls that we had been looking at previously, but now it's plotting all of the data on a map. So again, I can change that at least, at most. I can change what attributes I'm looking at, and the map updates with those values. Now, this is another really important piece about parameters. They are shared across the entire data source. So if you update a parameter value in one worksheet, it is updated in all of the worksheets. Now, we've kind of subverted this a little bit for the sake of this presentation. We actually have a different parameter for most of the sheets, and that's to keep us sane as presenters so that we don't accidentally break something and mess up the rest of the demo. But generally, the best practice is to use the same parameter in each worksheet so that you don't lose context as you're moving from one worksheet to another. So let's take a look at what that could look like. I have a dashboard here, and this has multiple sheets on it. It doesn't look like it at first. But if I actually change this parameter from chart to map, it brings up the map that I was showing. I'll dive into that in a sec. The other thing that I wanted to point out with this is we've arranged all of our parameter controls on the dashboard so that they create a human-readable sentence. That way, it's really intuitive how to interact with those controls and find exactly the data you're looking for. So let's look at that map again, see what was going on there. I'm going to jump over to that sheet, and there's a really tricky filter on this sheet. It's on hike title, but the condition of the filter is just that parameter. It's just map or chart. So that is a Boolean parameter. It has true and false, and the result of that is when the parameter is set to true, the value of this filter is true for every mark on the viz. And when the parameter is false, the value of this filter is false for every mark on the viz. That means that when I set it to true, every mark shows up, and if I set it to false, every mark goes away. So one interesting thing about Tableau is if there's no marks, there's no visualization. So when I switch this from map to chart, poof, it goes away. So I'm going to go back to my dashboard, and now we can see what's going on there. That scatter plot is always there, but when I switch this to map, the map has been floated over the top of it so that when I set the value to map, the map comes over on the top, and when I set it to chart, the scatter plot shines through behind. So we've done a bunch of stuff with a bunch of sets. You can tell we kind of like sets. But where should we go from here, Nick?
All right, so let's look at a different data set. Here, if the first data set was the guidebook of all the hikes, this data set is observations of people who actually took the hikes. And so you can imagine somebody out hiking in the wilderness, writing down observations, what's the condition of the trail, or what kind of wildlife did they see. And at the end of their hike, they distribute that note into a box somewhere, and that becomes part of our data set. Now, what I want to show here, across the x-axis are weeks of the year, and the y-axis here are the highest point somebody got to during their hike. And you can see a couple interesting things in this data. You can see the hiking season starts pretty early, and as the summer progresses, we get more and more people hiking, and they get to higher and higher elevation. Now, one of the things we can do with this data is to create these bins where we have, across the y-axis, we have bins of 2,000 feet of elevation. But if we can adjust those bins, you might see additional details pop out of view. So as we sort of increase this granularity, you start to see there's actually another little peek out here in the fall as people are going and looking at fall colors. Now, just like we showed with the reference line and the top N filter, this is one of those places that Tableau gives you easy access to your parameter values. So in here, when I go and edit the definition of this bin, you'll see that we can set the size of the bin directly to the parameter. So right there. This is definitely something we see a lot of people do using parameters. Now, our next tab is looking at observations over time. So this gives you a view of how many people saw each of these attributes at any given point in time, as well as the total number of records. So Matt, why don't we do some analysis on this?
Yeah, so the first thing that I see when I look at this data is that the number of records is not consistent across the entire year. And that makes sense. More people are going out hiking in the summer than in the winter. So one of the things that I've learned doing data analysis with Tableau is that changing my aggregation can sometimes lead to different insights. So I'm going to go ahead and do that using a parameter. I have my parameter already set up here. Its values are sum and percent. And I'm going to wire it up to a measure. I'm going to edit this calculation. And again, we're back to our old friend, the case statement. We're going to, when the value is set to sum, we're going to return the sum of my measure. And when the value is set to percent, it's going to return a calculation that returns the percentage of that measure. And now, when I change from sum to percent, I see a different view on my data, which points out some other features of it. Like, even though it looked like there were a ton of people seeing wildflowers, only a little over half of the people who go out in the peak of wildflower season see wildflowers, while 80% of the people who go out hiking in the fall see fall colors. So another thing that's really cool to do with parameters is change what measure you're looking at. So I'm going to use it to pick which measure we're looking at one at a time. You might use this if you're trying to look at profit versus sales versus revenue, and letting somebody have that control to switch out those measures. So all I have to do here, once again, we're back to making case statements in a calculated field, and I want to draw your attention to one interesting piece of this. You'll notice that instead of returning the measure directly, we're returning the aggregated measure. The reason for this is actually for performance. If you return the measure itself, this will be a row-level calculation, which means that the case statement needs to be evaluated for every row of data. But if you aggregate it, it will return the aggregates, and the case statement will only have to be evaluated once. Now, this doesn't work for every type of analysis that you want to do, but if you do know the aggregation beforehand that you want, this can be a good way to save on performance. And now, when I change the selected attribute, the viz updates so I can look at one measure at a time. Now, I'm going to take this and use it to build a bit of a highlighter. So I have all of my attributes up on screen at once, but now I'm going to now I'm going to pull out that measure that I had just created, and I'm going to pull it out as a dual axis. So I pull it out here as a dual axis, I synchronize the axes, and I color it a nice jolly orange, and maybe make it a little bit bigger. And now, when I change the value of my parameter, a different line gets highlighted in that nice orange color. Now, this isn't the only way to do this. Depending on the shape of your data, there's a couple of approaches to get here. There's even a really handy tool here, which is the data highlighter, and I can just hover over and see items highlighted. But remember, parameters are about driving many behaviors off of the same control. So, Nick, what other behaviors could we drive off of this?
Yeah, so we're a pretty visual group, and we love imagery and context, and I think we can kick this up a notch by adding a background image. So here we go. There. Now, as we choose the different measures, we're also going to insert a different beautiful background image. So here's the snowfall. We can look at berries, fall foliage. And you could imagine this being a customer logo or a representation of a type of cohort in your analysis, maybe the product that you're looking at analyzing. So as you're giving people this extra level of control to shift perspectives, you can use imagery as a way to help them understand what they're looking at. So it's pretty easy to do. We go to the background images for the data set. And right here, you can see we're referencing that same parameter. And when the parameter is set to a certain value, we tell Tableau to go use that background image. If we open one of these up, you can see we can set some of the X and Y boundaries. We can adjust the washout if you want just a really light background image. But this is how we can use a parameter to drive both the highlighting and that background image. So at this point, I want to take a step back and just recap a few things we've seen. We've seen that parameters can be used to drive which measure we're looking at. They can be used to drive how we aggregate that measure. They can be used to pick different dimensions. And in the case that those dimensions, like on the map, are kind of like a hierarchy, you can almost adjust level of detail that way. You know, how many marks do I want to see? Do I want to see the regions or the hikes themselves? And when you start combining these basic building blocks, you can build all sorts of interesting views. You can control how small multiples are displayed. You can potentially build something that feels a little more like a pivot chart that you're giving out to your users, where they get to choose which dimensions and which measures are in the analysis. So you can build a dashboard that's a little broader and give them the ability to select the fields that they're most interested in. And I think if you go out to Tableau Public and some of the community sites and you see some of these beautiful creations from our community, if you start piecing these apart, a lot of that underlying behavior is based on these 4 techniques. Now, we're looking at time series data here. There's a few other things we can do with time series. You saw a few of them in the keynote with parameter actions, that ability that as you click on a mark, you can use that as the parameter value and then maybe time index to a certain given point in time. But this is a little more manual version. And it's an observation that Matt and I made as we were looking through the data set. So this is showing, in orange, it's a given year's value for, in this case, snowfall. And in blue is the average across multiple years. And so as we were stepping through the data, we noticed here that in 2015, the snow dried up pretty quickly. It all melted pretty early in the season. And we wanted to know how many weeks early was that. So what we did was we built this other parameter to adjust the weeks. And as I click on this parameter, I can actually shift one of those lines relative to the other. And so here I can see that just about 10 weeks difference. 2015 was 10 weeks earlier than the other years on record. Now, one thing I want to point out here about using a calculation, in this case, a calculation driven by the parameter to select which year, if I was filtering on years to try to filter down to just 2015, I would probably lose a lot of that context in my data set because those other rows would go away. And so by using these sort of calculations and parameters to pull and highlight certain segments of the data, we can do that comparison against the total without losing any records or losing any rows. So we'll look at how this calculation works. We'll come down here to our data window, edit the calculation. And again, it's a pretty simple calculation here. We're doing a lookup based on the number of weeks, and we're just shifting by making it a -1, multiplying by -1. Now, there's some other things we can do with dates. We showed you drilling down on a map by choosing the level of detail and granularity on the map. We can do the same thing on a continuous date axis. So here I have years, and as I choose from the dropdown, I can go month or even day. And to do that, we have a pretty simple set of if statements. So for each value of the parameter, we're going to grab a different date truncation and return that and plot that in the view. Now, we're also combining this with a feature we launched a few releases ago, which is for continuous axes and bar marks, we can actually now specify how wide should each of these bars be. And so we're taking advantage of that. I have another calculation called size, and that sizing calculation is just returning a different width, relative width for each of the bars. So if we go in here, you see we're taking the minimum of that. If we edit the calculation, you'll see that for each level of granularity, we're using that parameter again to specify the relative width of the bars. And you can go in here and tweak these numbers. They're kind of magic numbers. I just picked whatever I thought looked OK for this particular data set, but you can go in and change that as much as you want. Another thing we can do with parameters and dates is to do smoothing or averaging. So how many of you deal with moving averages, 7-day, 14-day, 30-day? Yeah, so you may know that in different situations, your user may want to look at a different period of data or compare the 15-day versus the 30-day. And this is another use of parameters. We can go in here. In this particular data set, this is temperatures at one of the hikes. And so we can go in here to the calculation. And you'll see we're doing a window average on the observed temperature. And we're passing into that average how many points we want to go back. The +1 is there because 0 is counted as a day. So just use that to make it a nice even number. So that's how parameters are used inside of Tableau. But there's a whole other set of scenarios for parameters where we're interfacing with other products and platforms. And one of those that we can do is we can actually use a parameter to drive behavior in Python. So we've got all these observations. I told you people are writing down notes, and we want to search through those notes to find certain keywords. And Tableau can do some string comparison, but we can do that in Python pretty easily as well. And in the future, maybe we would want to do some additional text analytics. So here we have a view of the hikes and how many of them contain the string goat. And to do that, come over here, and we'll look at our table calc. So when we edit this, you'll see that we have Python here inside of the calculation. And what Tableau is going to do is it's going to take that script, and it's going to take the report summary column, and it's going to send that plus the value of the parameter over to Python. Python's going to do some calculations, and it's returning back to us a column of data that are the number of occurrences divided by the total number of records, essentially just an easy percentage. But this gets rerun every time we update the parameter. So if we wanted to switch from how many have goats to how many have bears, we can do that simply. And Tableau is sending that data and bringing back the result right here into the view. Another integration that we can do using parameters is custom SQL. So here I have a highway map of the western United States. And this data is coming from a SQL server. Each state has a different unique ID. And I've created a parameter here that maps to those values. And just like before, I'm using that aliasing function to give it nice friendly names so that I don't have to remember that California is state number 6 and Oregon state 41. The parameter takes care of that for me. So when I go to my data source and edit my custom SQL, you'll see here I'm currently just doing a select star, grabbing the whole table, but I can uncomment the second line, and I can create a where clause where Tableau is going to pass that parameter in and ask the database which of the rows match that state code. Now, I wouldn't do this for a simple quick filter. Tableau does well enough at writing SQL that this example wouldn't be the best. But if you're calling out to custom stored procedures and custom views, and you're already using custom SQL, this is a way to take that parameter value and push it down to the database. In fact, I had an interesting doctor session a couple days ago where a customer was saying their DBA was looking at the logs down at the database level, and they were having trouble figuring out which workbook it was coming from. And we thought about, well, could we create a parameter and save that, give it a default value of the workbook title, and actually use custom SQL to pass that down and put it somewhere in the SQL statement so that they can help debug it. And so just kind of like, just being aware of that may unlock new use cases for you if you're thinking about the fact that you can take this value and pass it down in that SQL. So those are a few of the endpoints between Tableau. Matt, do you want to show us some other interactivity?
Yeah, so one of the really cool things you can do with visualization is to embed it in a website. And parameters are a way where you can interact between an embedded, or the website that the visualization is embedded into the visualization. So I've set this little blog post up about things you might encounter while hiking. And I'm using a JavaScript library called Waymarks to detect when I scroll through different sections of my blog post. And then it is using JavaScript APIs to set the value of a parameter into the visualization that's hosted here so that the highlighting will update based on the section that I've scrolled through. So you can see as I scroll down, I scroll past fall colors, and then our line for fall colors updates to reflect where I am in the blog. And then I scroll down again, and I see the flowers line highlight. So really cool way of setting parameter values. We've already talked a lot about how you can use those parameters, but this is a cool way of setting that value. Another really interesting, thing for setting parameter values is the dashboard extensions, which similarly can update parameter values. And there's a lot of really cool stuff out there, and I encourage you to check it out. The last really cool way of setting parameter values I want to draw attention to is using the URL of a workbook. So I actually have a link here in the See Details tooltip that is going to take me to the workbook in Tableau Online, but it is going to set the value of a parameter in the URL that it sends you to, so that when you get to that workbook, it has this parameter set to the same value, and you keep that context as you go in. So let's take a look. I click on that. It takes me to my workbook. We can see here that selected attribute equals flowers. And just like that, the flowers attribute is set when you link into the workbook. So this is a really cool tool for deep linking into a published workbook. It's also a really cool tool for using this. You can use this tool to link between workbooks. Let's say you've built out several workbooks that are all dealing with similar data, and you want to go from one to the other while keeping some parameter values the same. The URL actions can be a way of setting that parameter value so that you don't lose context as you're moving from one thing to another. So that pretty much wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for being here. We had a great time sharing all these cool things you can do with parameters. We hope you guys go out and use them yourselves. We hope you go out onto Tableau Public and see how other people are using parameters. We've barely scratched the surface of all of the power that's here. It's really about using these as building blocks to build on top of each other and build out really cool interactive experiences for your users. So get inspired and then tell us. We're inspired by all the amazing things that the community does with Tableau. And so go out there, do amazing things. We'll see you around the conference later today, and hopefully see you out at Data Night Out tonight. And Nick and I will be up here. We'll hang out for questions just up in the front here until they kick us out. And thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.